Now, there are lots of different ways you can classify learning. One other way of classifying learning is into domains of learning based on what you are learning, whether it's knowledge or attitude or a physical skill. Let's take a look at the three domains of learning. The first domain of learning is known as cognitive. That's when you're learning knowledge. The next domain of learning is known as the affective domain. That's when you're learning attitudes and values and beliefs. And the final domain of learning is known as the psychomotor domain. That's when you're learning physical skills. In other words, when you learn motor skills, you're in the psychomotor domain. Now, each of these domains can be organized from the least complex thing a student has to do to the most complex thing. That's called a hierarchy. And they use the word taxonomy when they're referring to that hierarchy. Now, taxonomy refers to classifying organisms into categories. In other words, it's the classification of plants and animals. Well, the behavior scientists saw this word taxonomy and thought, boy, that's a cool word. So they stole that sucker, and so they used the word taxonomy to mean the listing of the hierarchy of objectives within a domain. Let's see what we're talking about here. You did want to learn this stuff, didn't you? Let's take a look at the cognitive domain. And this is what is known as the taxonomy for the cognitive domain, and it's a listing of the things that a student has to do to learn in the cognitive domain from the least complex to the most complex. It's kind of the steps or the objectives as you're going through learning. Well, the least complex thing in the cognitive domain is knowledge. That's when you can recall something or recognize something. Then you have that lowest level in the cognitive domain. The next level is comprehension, and that's when you can interpret what you have learned there and even extrapolate and understand the whole situation. That's comprehension. The next level is application, and that's when you can go from specific to general or general to specific. For instance, you look around and they tell you that's a chair and that's a chair and that's a chair, and you see that all chairs have a back on them, so you can make a general rule about chairs. That's application. Then you can go a little bit further and you say, okay, this next thing I see over here lets you sit down and it has a back on it. It must be a chair. When you can do that kind of thing, that's called application. The next level is analysis, and that is when you can see relationships. You can say, okay, I learned that that's a chair and that's a stool. They have a relationship, but they're not the same thing, and they're somewhat related to beds. Well, that's called analysis, when you can see those kinds of relationships. The next level is synthesis, and that is when you can create new relationships. You begin to make rules and see these rules and see how they all relate to each other. How do beds relate to chairs, and what kind of relationships do they have? That's synthesis. And finally, when you can use judgment, that's evaluation. When you can say, well, now, wait a minute, this is a really good chair. That's a pretty crummy chair. This bed's better than that bed. You can evaluate them. Then you've reached the highest level in the cognitive domain, and that's when you can use judgment, and that's evaluation. So this is the taxonomy for the cognitive domain. Now let's take a look at the taxonomy for the affective domain. The affective domain is when you remember you're learning values or beliefs. So let's take a look at that. The affective domain, first of all, you're in the receiving mode. You're willing to pay attention. That's the least complex thing when you're learning in the affective domain. The next thing is that you've taken in this information or this kind of value, and you're responding to it. You're changing your belief and you're responding to it. It's changing your behavior. You're doing it voluntarily and you're complying with it. That's the responding level in the affective domain. The next level up is valuing, and that's when you finally said, I accept that. It's part of me. It's in my value system. You've reached the next level in the affective domain. Finally, when you've organized this and rearranged your value system to completely incorporate it, and you've organized your values, you've reached the organization level of the affective domain. And finally, when you've taken this belief or this value and have incorporated it in your character, that's the characterization level of the affective domain. It's become part of your character. So the most complex outcome of the affective domain is characterization, which means you incorporate this new value into your life. You know, there's hardly anything in life more fun and more challenging than landing a tail dragger. How about this open cockpit tail dragger? You think this guy's working on his skills in the psychomotor domain? I think so. So let's take a look at the taxonomy for the psychomotor domain. And once again, we're going from least complex to most complex. The first thing you work on in the psychomotor domain is perception, and that is having stimuli come in and affect your senses. Then, when you relate to those and kind of make them know about them and they become cues to you, you have reached the level of set. And when you can perform somewhat in the psychomotor domain, you've reached the guided response level. But when you can perform simple tasks well, then you've reached the mechanism level. And then finally, or next in this level, you get to the complex overt response level. Overt means acting out, and that's the level at which you can do a skilled performance of complex tasks. And when you've reached the adaptation level, then you can modify for special problems. Let's assume you're coming into land and there's an obstacle. You have to do it a little differently this time. When you can do that successfully, you're at the adaptation level. And finally, when you can try new ways of doing it on your own, you've reached the origination level, and that's the highest level. You can develop new patterns of doing things. You have creativity, and that's the highest level. Now, the thing they're going to ask you on the test that you need to know is the lowest level on the psychomotor domain is perception. So now you know about the three domains of learning, and you know what in the Sam Hill they mean when they use the word taxonomy.